Welcome, Michael, one of our co-investigators. We've yet to have you involved as much as we are looking forward to having you involved in our team meetings.
Yeah.
I am Vicky Palmer, for those who don't know me. I'm the Director of our National Mental Health Research Translation Centre, and I'm located here on Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it is with great pleasure that we have Michael joining us from Curtin University in WA to hear about this, what I feel is an amazing program of work, and I'm sure you will all share in that as you hear it, called Our Journey, Our Story. As I mentioned, Phil Orcher here over to my left at the moment will be closing the events and giving a bit of a short perspective. I'll be listening in at that time with my video off, but I'm definitely here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to share, Michael. I won't introduce you. I think you're well and truly able to do that in terms of your background and where you're from, Michael. That would be wonderful to hear from you. So thanks everyone for joining, and we're looking forward to hearing about your program and talk today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. I'll acknowledge here that we're meeting on Wajak Nyunga Buja, and also pay our respects and to country and to elders. Many of the elders who have given generously to our project as it happens. But yeah, and also acknowledge the other young leaders that are part of our work that continue to give also generously to the work that we do, and to the community generally, and importantly how the Buja, the country, supports all of us in terms of that work we're doing together. I'd also like to just introduce my team. They might want to do that little thing at the bottom and put their hand up and say hi and give it a little wave. So it's, well, not all my team, as it turns out. Helen Flavel, who's joined us, was very much a part of the team until just not long ago. So Helen, Victoria, you might recall, was one of the people that was liaised with you when the application was actually being developed.
Yeah.
So Helen has joined us for this presentation, and also Amanda Sibasada, who is one of the works with myself on the Our Journey, Our Story project. So yeah, so introducing them also to this, what we're doing today. So Marg's going to run the slides for us, and so we'll get started. So we'll share the screen. I was going to ask Phil if he wanted to do an acknowledgement to where he is as well. Oops.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I just want to acknowledge country as well, and I'm up on Kumbangi country, and acknowledge all the countries everybody's calling in from as well. Thanks for that, Hank.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So anyway, the slides are this. So a little about myself. So I'm a Nyunga man. My family is in my mother's country, grandmother's country is Yuit, which is one of the clan groups, Nyunga clan groups across. There's 14 Nyunga clan groups in the southwest of WA. So Nyunga, Yuit country is just north of Perth. Like a lot of Nyunga country, it has its own special significance. Not always, what's the word? It has, yeah, somewhat of a dark history, somewhat, you know. So on Nyunga, up on my country, one of the major sort of settlements where children were taken was the Namor River settlement. So that's up on my country. As well as Eunorcia Mission, which was run by the Catholics, and that also had a lot of, and my family were there too. So over the years. So Mark, you want to put the slides up? I'm currently, I'm a CI on the CIA on two large projects. Both ones, this one is funded through the MMRF, the Million Minds Research Fund, and Looking Forward, Moving Forward project, which is funded through, it's a partnership grant from the NHMRC. We do other smaller projects, got quite a large team now. Essentially, the methodology for all the projects is much the same. And I'll talk through that as we go through the slides. Next slide, Mark. So the program of our work, this is the presentation overview. So today's presentation will go through this list. Program of work, the values and principles that underpin the work that we do, particularly around what we think of as relational research. Who's involved? There's the Looking Forward team, the Our Journey team, Our Journey, Our Story team. And then I'll talk more about the Our Journey, Our Story in greater depth as an example of the work that we're doing, through to what the activities are so far and then the findings. So the program of work currently we're doing, so we got the Looking Forward, Moving Forward. We had the Building Bridges. That's was the Building Bridges, in fact, is the work that we started. We'd been working in the adult mental health space for many years with the Looking Forward project. And over that period of time, the elders had said to us on a number of occasions, there's a lot that's going on for our young people, and that what we feel we're doing here, we think you could do in the youth mental health space. So with their advice and guidance and direction, we then started to do the work that we're doing now in the youth mental health space. So Building Bridges was the first, and that was completed 2-3 years ago, and then we scaled that up to now the Our Journey, Our Story. We're doing an ethical decision-making project that was funded by the state government, came out of the work for all of last year through COVID, and the state government gave money to all the universities at some point last year, and so they with a proviso that 200,000 of $1 million that was given be for Aboriginal projects, and so we were able to get that money, and we joined with another researcher, senior researcher in the town here, a colleague of mine, Professor Pat Dudgeon, and so we both see eyes on that project. And then the Devakan Calling Wangani, which is Nyunga, means steady walking, talking, is a project we're doing actually in the university around Curtin University. And this has been ongoing for a little while, but at this very important stage of actually developing an Aboriginal research strategy. But typically, as many universities do, often it's an in-house sort of development, discussion, so forth. Because of our work with the community, they thought, as we did, that it was an opportunity to bring the community into those discussions, and so the community will be involved in doing and being involved in the co-design, really, of what an Aboriginal research strategy should be in terms of a university like Curtin. So we're excited about that. We've started, but most of the work will begin next year. These are the values that underpin our research. Again, they're not, well, I share these values personally, and I know the team does, but it's very much aligned with where the community have pointed us in this direction and really reinforced in that everything that we've done with them. And that is, if we're about doing this work that we want to do, then it has to have trust inbuilt. Trust is something that I see it as a verb, a doing. You just don't, trust doesn't just appear magically, as I think sometimes people feel it does. You have to work at it and not just in getting people's trust. You have to actually, to ensure you maintain the trust of people, you have to continue that work. So it's very much, there's a lot in this word. And within trust, there's also critical to actually that ensuring that trust is maintained is this, the concept of reciprocity. We often think of ourselves, thankfully and fortunately, we don't do research as was done 20, 30 years ago, where we would just go and just take from people whatever we thought we had a right to do and not give anything back at all. So I think that thankfully has changed. If not, people soon are told that this is how it's done. I think, though, it's not something that's actually taught in universities, I feel. Still, which is quite staggering in itself, really. But reciprocity definitely is important in this work that we do. Inclusivity, again, is that everyone is involved. Everyone needs to be involved. I think what we now have with, and this is something if you haven't already aware or haven't come across, is the data sovereignty agenda, which means that there's a different approach now, and this is about Indigenous data sovereignty I'm referring to, that doing with and alongside of and ensuring that Aboriginal voices are there through the whole research process, regardless, is the foundation of that work. So, and particularly around ownership, who actually owns the data is becoming more and more critical. And I know in the lived experience space, this is something that's been really very much discussed as well. In the past, where researchers thought they owned the data and then they could do whatever they wanted with the data, it's no longer the case. To go back and ensure that the community's voice is actually part of that also and is critical to going forward. And I know with the NHMRC and ethics and so forth, you have to demonstrate that the community are with you before you start any data collection or whatever. The other point to this is adaptability. Clearly, adaptability is what is required in working with the community. We say and talk about staying with the rhythm of the community. I know research has targets and milestones and all those kinds of things, but they're artificial and artificially adopted and so forth. And it's usually something the bean counters want to do. But in a sense, it doesn't work when you work with communities like ours. You have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable, and you have to move where the community's at. You can't expect the community to move with you on these artificial timelines. You have to be able to move with them. And again, this is something that often researchers struggle very much with. They feel that the master they're tied to is these targets and milestones, which I think is foolish. It does take another skill set to do that, but I think we've been able to do it, and happy to have conversations with people if they'd like to, but about that, but essentially that's the work. I just want to talk about relationships. I'm using this as an example, this timeline, but essentially when we started with the work, the looking forward work, if you can imagine, and I think this is, Perth, Melbourne, similar, Sydney as well, the major capital cities. For Aboriginal people, there's an invisibility there, both real, but also convenient, if you like, in regard to where Aboriginal people fit. And so what I'm saying is that when we spoke with the elders in the very early part of the Looking Forward project, they said to us, it was a constant theme to us, was that their view was non-Aboriginal people, in particular, in this case, service providers, had not a clue about who Aboriginal people were, but what we think of and talk about as an Aboriginal worldview. Now, sure, we're not expecting everyone to know what an Aboriginal worldview is, but the point they were making is that for Aboriginal people, there was a lot of what they thought or understood about Aboriginal people were purely that what they'd read in the papers or what they'd heard in the media, which was always somewhat negative and continues to be the case. And for them, that distorted who we are. So they used to say, that's not who we are who we are. So this, for me, that goes to this idea of relational and whatever research that we get involved with, and we talk about relational research. and we've always stated that to actually work with Aboriginal people in an effective way needs researchers to actually get to a point where they invest in both time and resources in developing, building relationships. And so this timeline really is about, it's just because this idea, the other thing the elders told us, which sort of rang true for me personally, but struck a chord with all of us, was they said that non-Aboriginal people, particularly in Perth and in WA, had this belief that Noongar people had no culture. And so for me, I thought about that a lot, and we came up with this just as a kind of way to explain to demystify that, or to whatever, run counter to that argument. And so before 1829, before the tall ships came here, Noongar people had culture, and that was living, it was breathing, it was very much a part of who we are. Then the settlers, Stirling came, and they were settlers. There wasn't a penal colony when it first started. That happened. Convicts came later. But I think often, and this is probably reported as such, that from 1829 through to today, that point in time meant that Aboriginal people, in this case Noongar people, culture ended essentially. And it's probably not true. And I talk about this just in very general terms, but 1829 to 1840, there was lots and lots of conflict. We know that, and that is recorded. But the point that I make is between 1840, let's say, to 1890, the actual population of WA then was 25,000 people. 25,000 people, that's, very small in number. I mean, it sounds a lot, but it's not. And their impact on the way of life of Aboriginal people was minimal, if at all, really. So Aboriginal Noongar people lived pretty much as they had lived before 1829, mostly. Things changed after 1890 because we had the gold rush. And that point between 1890 and 1905 and beyond is when there was huge intervention on Aboriginal people's lives. We had the 1905 Act here in WA, which then categorised Aboriginal people as half caste, quarter caste. We didn't give that classification to ourselves; that was imposed on us. And then the removal of children began and continues to this day. And that had a huge impact on Aboriginal people in their lives. But still, there was still a lot that Aboriginal people were doing, Noongar people in this case were doing, living as they always had and always continue to do so. Languages were still retained, cultural activities were still being done. And the point to that is, and how do we know that? In 2006, native title was granted to the southwest, actually to Whadjuk Noongar country, which, and this is the bit that I always find amazing. his native title was granted over Perth, the capital city of Perth. So for a couple of years, Nyungar people owned Perth, figuratively speaking, as we say. Not that anything changed, because nothing would. And it was Justice Wilcox was the presiding judge in the native title court. He'd taken evidence from elders, a lot of evidence from elders over a number of years. And his summing up of his judgment was that he believed that Aboriginal people, like the elders in particular, had demonstrated unequivocally their connection to country. And that's, to be granted native title, you have to show and demonstrate unbroken, continual contact, maintenance of country. And the elders were able to do so. He also said in his summing up that he knew that his judgment would be contested, and in his view, it probably would win because they'd probably find some kind of legal kind of argument or something that would overturn it. But in his view, his opinion was that average, Nyungar people were able to substantiate beyond any question and doubt to him that native title should be granted. And we say that because I feel that this idea that Nyungar people don't have culture flies in the face. Well, so having no culture, this judgment flies in the face of all of that, what we say. So, but this goes to the core about relationships, and relationships are critical and central to all of the work that we do. And I feel while we live in this, and whether it's only modernity that's put us in this space or whatever, but we continue to other those who aren't part of the group that sort of the mainstream, let's call it. So next slide, Mark. So we talk about relational, and again, this goes to the core of our work. Relational, the values that underpin relational are having this diverse ways of knowing, being, and doing. And for us, ethical means, or the values that underpin ethical means being accountable to and for the community. But it's also being accountable to everything that would be perceived as non-living. So, the land, the country, the plants, all of that. And the elders talk about that all the time. They talk about country, they talk about the non-living and whatever. So I think we can't just be too prescriptive here when we talk about relational. And researchers also need to know that as well, that all voices count in terms of co-design, that everyone is invested and should benefit from this, including, again, the things that we don't think of as, well, they're not non-material, but this, idea that, the country is not invested and doesn't benefit from that. That we're process-oriented and it's longitudinal. It's about the story, always about the story and holding the story and being held by the stories and being held by people and country as much as anything else. And the sovereign data rights, as I referred to. As opposed to what we see mostly in the research space, it's purely and often transactional. It's contractual, it's objectives that need to be met, timelines, sort of all that I mentioned before, targets and so forth, milestones. When we talk about ethical standards in the transactional space, I think it's all about risk management, to property, often to people, which is a good thing, but it's usually can be property as well. And that becomes, the point that everyone sort of lands to is what is the risk management here, which doesn't allow for fluidity, flexibility, being able to move where the community wants you to move, because these risk standards, as we like to say, constrict us to do that, what we feel we are only allowed to do. I think it also, in that regard, de-skills us in many ways, because if we're just dictated to by the system and only adhere to what the system says, we don't allow for our own creativity to come to the fore. It's clinical, there's very little emotional investment in the transactional space. There's no place for it because it's all about, we've got to deliver, you've got to give to us, and it's contractual agreement. And it's very much outcomes and output focused. And it often ignores the contribution of others in the space, the process, if you like. If we think about an output like papers and other publications and so forth, it's always about the researchers having their names published on the paper. We've got a paper, we've concluded all the elders as authors on that paper. And that's the right thing to do. It's their intellectual knowledge that we've drawn upon. And yeah, you know, the output in this, and often this transactional space is only very limited to a few. And the other big question is around who owns the data. In this transactional space, you sign a consent form and this gives me rights to everything that you've told me, and that's it, end of story, which I don't necessarily abide or agree to. And in the conversations with the elders and others, it's been their view also that that's not necessarily the way it should be. The sovereign data rights thing goes to that point as well. I think there's going to be some sharp U-turns on this over time, but I think we're moving to that very quickly, particularly in the health research space. I feel that they're in for some rude shocks in the near future. So relationships for us underpin everything we do. We talk about it, and I talk about it, and I talk about it, and I talk about it some more. And everyone we work with, and you can see, I mean, we work with Headspace operations currently in Perth, in the youth mental health space, and they get it. Because intuitively, instinctively, this is where we want to go to, but the system says otherwise, and the structures that support the system mean that this is what you have to do. But instinctively and intuitively in our human condition this is what we want. And yet we have to override that, as these guys would say to us, have to override it to actually conform to what the system wants. I think that's a mistake. Next slide, Mark. So looking forward, research team, as I said, so here are the team, Mark's here from the team, and we have a number of Aboriginal staff working with us on the team. So next slide, Mark. This is Our Journey, Our Story team. Tilsa, who's not in the photos, is one of the team members. So I'm going to talk about Our Journey, Our Story. So this is building bridges to improve Aboriginal young people's mental health and wellbeing. Again, I've mentioned this, what it was. So next slide, Mark. Project aim is to improve the accessibility and responsiveness of Headspace services so they best meet the needs of Aboriginal young people, their families and communities. Overwhelmingly, because before we started the project, I asked each of the Headspace operations across WA if they thought, a couple of questions, sorry. Would they be interested and would they participate with us on the project, like join us as a partner? And then I would mention why and what the aims were of the project. And overwhelmingly, they all said, yes, we need to do better. We at this point, question ourselves, both our effectiveness, but even our relevance in the community. And I thought that was very an honest approach, and I was somewhat encouraged by what they were talking about. Next slide, Mark. So these are the chief investigators on this project with us. One point I'd make is there's 10 chief investigators on this project, 8 of whom are Aboriginal. And there's also Kiani, who's the young woman who's listed on the bottom of the CIs. This was a presentation we gave to the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service, who are the lead agency for the Broome Headspace. And their request directive to us was, can we have an Aboriginal young person as the CI on the project? And I went, yeah, that's a great idea. And so Kiani is a CI. Now, again, you know, this does throw cat amongst the pigeons occasionally, because what you get is, oh, this is the system. This is not how the system works. And, you know, she doesn't work at a university. Like, that's not always necessary, but a whole bunch of other questions that are asked. And I feel what part of this work that we do, and particularly we talk about this a lot with our team, is we see ourselves as both doing what we're doing, and that is to ensure that we improve the mental health outcomes for Aboriginal young people for this project, and across all the projects for that matter. But we also see our role as being somewhat disruptive to what the system is wanting us all to do. Because I've always of the view too, we have to push back on some of these, and I say not all draconian, but some of them are limiting, or they try to limit how and what we should be able to do. And so disruptive in one regard, but also this points to, and I think goes to, what does, for us as Aboriginal researchers, we want to get to a place where we can start to confidently say we are decolonising this whole area of work that we do. I'm particularly of the view that, you know, the academy is still one of the last bastions where colonisation reigns supreme, essentially, unknowingly oftentimes. I mean, I don't know how it is at other institutions, but I know at our institution, there's still sort of, they somewhat get blindsided by that, what was known to all of us, but still totally unaware of some of the systemic racism that still exists and how discriminatory some practices still are. So our job, both as researchers, but as academics, is to challenge, but also to be a voice that disrupts the status quo, because otherwise, what's the point? I'm not here to reinforce the status quo. Sorry, it's not my case. It's not my job. So we do everything we need to do, and we don't, you know, we're not about cutting corners or doing things like that, but we do not deviate or resolve from the fact that this, first and foremost, the community comes first, not the system and not the institution. The community always comes first, and that's non-negotiable for us. So these are our community co-researchers. So we call the elders and the young people who work on our Journey, Our Story project. And I have to tell you this because we just came back from Broome, Amanda and I, during the week, and we presented, so we did a presentation to all the co-researchers a couple of months ago. Now we came back to present to the Headspace service, you know, like to all staff, and then to the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service, the lead agency. And after the presentation to the Headspace staff, someone asked one of the elders about being involved in the project, and the question was asked, you know, why did they remain, or what was their main point that they wanted to make from being involved? And this really made me quite glad, actually. They said, because they felt valued. And to me, that's when the community says that, I'm truly pleased. I think for the Aboriginal community, this has been very true, is that past research, I'm not saying all current research, and in fact I know it's not true, but past research has done a lot of damage to Aboriginal people. It's definitely been a tool used by the system and governments in the past to push their own agendas. And I think researchers themselves have been complicit in that, colluded with governments in the past as well. Maybe knowingly and unknowingly, I'm not sure, but we need to understand that research is still considered in many ways still in the community something that's been used to oppress and continue to oppress community members. So the stakeholders and sites for the Our Journey, Our Story have been the Broome Headspace. We work at the Midland Headspace and at the Osborne Park and Joondalup Headspace. The other partners are Headspace National, Origin and Aqua, which is the peak body for the Aboriginal mental health services across the state. This is we call it co-design, we call it conditions for engagement, we call it a number of things actually. But essentially, this is how we work with, and this again was co-designed by elders, a lot like elders from Looking Forward project. I think what we often mistakenly work with is assumptions that we can just rock up in a community and go, here I am, so-and-so. Usually we trot out our titles, I'm professor or associate professor or doctor, whoever, immediately thinking that the community is going to go, oh, wow, swan at our feet or swoon at our feet or whatever they say. That's not how the community works. Often very skeptical. And I, even as an Aboriginal researcher, I've had that experience. They want to know who you are, really. I mean, who are you? Not your title. I mean, they get that all the time. Again, this is this worldview thing I refer to. We value relationships. We hold what relationships really are. I don't have a relationship with a title. Sorry, I have a relationship with a person, and so that's where the first hurdle that people have to overcome. So being motivated, being committed, being present, being teachable, staying connected, continuing weaving. These are all about unpacking the person, essentially, getting the ego out the way, because essentially, and we use our ego in many ways. I mean, not all bad. I mean, sometimes ego is good to provide a defense to what's going on outside the world. And I imagine, and also ego is used to sort of to dominate, as we know, to make a point. But this is about trying to get to the human you, whoever the human I is. This helps with that, because it's about questioning myself. One, my attitudes, my behavior, what I'm going to do, how I think and do, and so forth. And cleverly, and I say cleverly, because this is what the elders, through the conversations we had with them, sure, they didn't say let's be committed, but it was things like how they are committed, how they have, when they come into the space, they don't, I mean, sure, they have an agenda, everyone does, but when they come in because they represent the community. They're there because of their role in the community, because they have an important role in the community. They're committed. Every fibre, every part of their being is committed. And I try to get, this work is done with senior leaders in organisations. They can't match that ever, that kind of commitment. But I'm trying to get them to understand that this is what the community, when they talk about commitment, that's what they mean by commitment. I'm trying to get service leaders to think, can I get close to that? How do I even know what that is? And the being present when they come in again, the elders, and they model this all the time. When they're there, they're so present. They're not on their phones. They're not taking calls in the middle of a meeting. And they're not rushing off to another meeting. They're there. They're absolutely present. So in them being teachable, all of that is very critical to this work. And it is about unlearning, essentially, to the non-Aboriginal people that come to this space, if they're going to work with Aboriginal people. This is the testing ground. It's not, this is where people make it or not. Not everyone makes it, I must say, either. I wish that were the case, but it's not always necessarily true. Marg? So the elders have this lovely way of talking. I mean, because they do it. Well, I often used to say, because early days of looking forward, we get service providers would come and meet with the elders, and they come with their pens and their paper, and their pens poison, wanting to write down every piece of information the elders would talk to, and the elders would go off on appears to be a tangent, and then sort of go around and tell a story, and then that would couple up to another story in it, and it may not even be sequential in that it may not even follow a particular timeline or whatever. And people would go, oh, God, how do I do this? And they'd go away and think about it as well, and they'd talk among themselves and question, why are we doing this? Why is this important? And I used to say this is not rocket science, and now I've changed my mind. It certainly is rocket science, because this is what we call circular learning. And the circular learning is that, and I had a friend who's not Aboriginal, and she worked with elders over the years herself. And she said she would work with elders and she would tell me this is what they were doing, and I could relate to that. And she'd say all these stories, and we'd go around in circles and whatever. And she said, but what I couldn't work out is that would happen, and they'd often tell the same story, this repetitive learning thing. That's kind of how our mind works. Repetitively learning, and these stories, the same stories we get told. And she said, but at some point those stories would stop, and then there'd be a whole nother series of other stories would start. She said, I couldn't work it out until someone said, and no one would give her an explanation to that, the elders at least. And she said, until someone said, well, that's the elders saying, you've got the message and got what that was meant to tell you now, and then moving on to the next lot of stories for you to get some learning from. It's a very clever way to learn, because we become so familiar now with the didactic way of learning. We get information thrown as we write it down, and then we just regurgitate. What does that mean? There's no place to retain that. If you think about, and I quote Socrates now, not that I knew the man, but he said that when writing was invented, he said, there goes memory. And I think, the neuroscientists among us would say, well, we use different parts of our brain now because we don't have to hold memory anymore. It's stored on our phones or in our computers. But in societies and within groups of people where oral history is still very much part of their life experience. I remember my mum, I remember someone would come and visit, and she could go through, rattle off genealogies, like going back 3, 4, 5 generations. It was amazing, just holding this knowledge in her mind. That's what the power of stories are. It's about retention of memory, and importantly, holding that, continuing through it. And so the elders do this lovely way of sort of circular teaching, and that's how they teach young people. That's how they teach their grannies. Circular learning, teach stories, continually stories, deepening, meaningful. The stories might change a little bit. That's always the other thing, make it more interesting. You have to do that. But the essence of the story remains the same. And it's working slowly. And the other point the elders often say is Devakan. That's Nyungar word for steady, steady. And that circular way to tell a story is important, because the elders, one elder says this particularly, 2 ears, you dwonk, that's the Nyungar word for ears. Dwonk, 2, you got 2. You have to listen more than with your mouth when you talk. It's just little wisdoms like that. So Devakan, steady, steady has been the strongest. And we talk about that with the Headspace staff, and the elders talk about it. So it's become a mantra of sorts to all of us. One of the managers, and she laughs herself now, but she's one of these get up and go, and we're always saying Devakan, steady. But it's truly a learning space. It's an interactive learning, critical learning space in many ways. Why do we do it? Okay, so I've got to tell you this story, because early days of looking forward, we would meet with, and again, we were all on a steep learning curve, ourselves included. But we'd go to these meetings and because the elders had said, and I'd gone to the elders and said, because the community had said, well, this idea that these people don't know our culture, so let's do it, our way, cultural way, Aboriginal way. We get the elders in the space and they can become their teachers, because they're teachers of culture. So I went to the elders and said, would you do this? And they said, well, yes, but we make one condition. This is one stipulation we make, is that we only talk, they recognise our status, that we only talk to what we call Budias, the bosses in the organisation. So Budia to Budia. So that was non-negotiable. So it had to be with the senior execs. So we'd go along to these meetings with them, and all these senior people would be in the room with the elders. And typically, we'd go around the room doing introductions, and the elders would always say, my name is so-and-so, my country is this, my family is that, I come from here, these are my, and they'd always preface themselves around both the material and their family, but also country, always. It would never, ever not happen. Conversely, we go to there'd be a service provider, senior manager, and they would instantly go, my name is Joe or whoever, and I am the CEO of that organisation, and pass through. And at one of these meetings, one of the elders said and leaned over to one of the CEOs and said, you fellows know so much about us, but we don't know nothing about you. It was one of those woo moments. And I remember, and then we had another example later, but I won't go to that. But that was another beautiful example. And so what is critical here, totally, and it goes back to this, so in that space, all we saw was this transactional, and these guys couldn't move out of the transactional space. That's where they were trained to be. I'm talking about service providers now. But the Aboriginal, the elders were totally in the relational space. So we had this sort of conflictual space. It just was whatever. So how do we move beyond transactional to something relational? This is where the storing happens. And we started this, as most things I do, well, not all, but a lot, is that I intuitively go there, and this is what we decided, that we would get the elders and we would sit down in a room with a whole bunch of senior executives as they were, and just tell a bit about ourselves. And that's what we did. And it was truly amazing, as I'm sure you would kind of appreciate, to the point where it was transformational for many. And there's lots and lots of that I can talk about, what I won't, but it definitely is about relationship, and we've got to find ways where we can truly connect. If we stay in the transactional space, it's never going to work. The following up from the storing is about doing on country. Again, to break this nexus, this perception that we don't have culture. It's not true, we do. And so we go out on country, and you see, the non-Aboriginal people see both the power and the wisdom and the knowledge and just the way the elders interact with country is just phenomenal. And for many non-Aboriginal people, that's the first time they see that for themselves. They had that first-hand experience of that, or they have that first-hand experience. Again, that is also transformation. Always important, because it's about relationship. We have to get to the point where we have relationship. And, in all the time we've been doing this, and I've been doing it for a long time now, every time I'm just blown away how generous the community is, how generous the elders are, how generous the young people are in these spaces. It truly is amazing. And then, because our work is always about co-design, then we can go to do the work of co-design. We've now got the foundation for relationship. And the relationship is important, because what we want to include in this space a level of integrity so that we can all talk honestly. There's transparency. There's the opportunity to speak frankly and robustly when needed and necessary to do without what we have to do. So we've been co-designing with Headspace what a new service could be that would be safe for Aboriginal young people to go to, how it would increase the access of young people attending the service. And importantly, because this is where the structural change needs to happen, is around responsiveness on the part of the service. So we've done that. We've done that for all the Headspace operations. That's all been completed and we've done it till now. Next slide, Mark. So this is how we've done some. I think we've had 4 to 6 co-design workshops. So we presented back baseline data because we did all interviews with everyone as well. The research part continues underpinning all this work. Then we get the conditions right, whatever we need. Sometimes getting the conditions right, even though we've done all the work around relationships, sometimes we have to revisit some of that around what is truly commitment in this space for you. And that's a conversation, that's a dialogue that they have, service providers, in some of the cases with some of the Headspace operations they've had with the elders and the young people. What does commitment mean for you and what does that mean for me? And it's a robust conversation. And it has to be, because for everyone to be here, as I said before, elders and the young people come with every fibre and being in their body to this. What is your commitment? Can you match that? Don't think so entirely, but can you match at least some of it to get to that, so we all can be confident that what we're doing here is we're doing it together. And that's should be a given. I think people with lived experience want the same, wherever. They want to know that. I mean, I'm living with this, whatever it is I'm living with. You're getting paid to help me in ways so that I can, live more fully. Our investment is different. Our agenda even here is different. But we all got to get on the same page somehow on this. We do story mapping. We'll have an example of that for the young people. And it's the story mapping is what it is. We have this fictitious young person and we walk through what would this young person encounter if they came to a Headspace operation. What would be some of the barriers to them actually getting the service they got or should have? And then we review that, and then the presentation, and we agreed on what it is. That's the important bit. We all agree that this is what we all have said and stated, and what we've come to as a final set of, not always, some recommendations, but in our case, the task that we're actually going to do for the implementation. We also do, this is creating the culturally secure space. So there's homework. The elders do the acknowledging and welcome outside, wherever we can do that outside if possible. Constantly teaching, educating, reinforcing, embedding, all of this, what we think of as decolonising the work. Although for many, they don't realise that that's what's going on around them, but it's actually that. They've been, in many ways, unlearning a lot of that, what they've been doing, and relearning other stuff that they now embrace and take on board, which we've seen. Acknowledging, the sharing the stories is really important. And all of the Headspace staff that we've had working with us all appreciate the stories. Acknowledging the dates and so forth. And we do that. So they start to hear about, it's interesting mapping from when they started to where we are now. Lots of stuff is happening everywhere in every state and every capital city in the country, I'm sure. But we had some great events last year, and it's just, linking, connecting all the, to others, to these, what they are. Remind of the wisdom of the elders. And we always start with privileging the voices, because there is this still power differential regardless. We try to flatten the power where we can, but also to elevate the voices of the elders and young people. Again, that's around decolonizing. This is a story mapping, an example, all very colourful, lots of drawings. And again, it's we try to. I mean, the detail needs to be there, but we don't want to get stuck on the detail. It's more about the story and about how do people feel and what could we change. I think, no, my experience has been mostly that service providers want to go to detail because then they try to work back from the detail. And I encourage them to work in the reverse order. Go to blue sky thinking, then come back if you need to detail. Blue sky, what is actually possible? What is it that we'd love to see? And then work backwards from there. Blue sky thinking continually if we can. These are the activities that we've done. And I mean, again, this is a compositive sort of slide of everywhere we've been everywhere. So on country, staff presentations, introductions to the project, the baseline interviews, community events. And we've had, so you can see we're being very busy. And that's all the sites. And some of the reflections from the staff already of where they've been.
Thank you so much, Hank. That was inspirational.
I don't think we've finished yet.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's okay. But we're nearly finished. What's the next slide, Mark? Yeah, we don't need to go through these slides, Mark. We'll go to the last one. So a discussion. I don't know. This shack or this little hut here featured in the Warwick Thornton film, The Beach, and it's currently on SBS On Demand. If you go and watch it, it's fantastic. It was produced last year, and if you get to watch it, it's awesome. So we were there, and where the community we were on when we did our On Country up in Broome, that's where it was.